Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Over the last few months on this channel we have looked at a number of classic games from amongst the beat 'em up genre. Amongst these videos we have included the first two entries in the Final Fight series. Today we are going to round off the numbered trilogy by giving in-depth coverage to the third game in the series. Whilst people constantly talk about the original entry in the series, the third game rarely gets mentioned by anyone. So today we are going to analyse this game and come up with a good reason as to why. Is this game an underrated classic that deserves more eyes on it, or is it generally a lacklustre game that we should allow to fade into the sunset? Let's find out. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Final Fight 3. And why we never played it. Yeah! As discussed plenty of times on here before, the original Final Fight game was a smash hit from Capcom, released back in 1989. It was a high quality game that would go on to influence the entire genre. In fact, when the game was ported to the Super Nintendo as a console exclusive back in the day, it was this deal that would lead to the development of the Streets of Rage series on the Mega Drive, arguably the most beloved beat-em-up series of all time. The original Super Nintendo port of the game had a lot of missing features that are included in the original arcade game. Most notably, the SNES port offered no cooperative play mode, arguably one of the most important aspects of the beat-em-up genre. Final Fight 2 would fix this problem, offering 2-player cooperative play and the choice of 3 different playable characters. Unlike the first game, which was an arcade game that was ported over to the Super Nintendo, Final Fight 2 was simply a game that was programmed to be a true Super Nintendo exclusive. Despite the cooperative play, many people prefer the original game over the second entry, as for some reason the game appears to be graphically scaled back from that of the original. The only explanation I can perhaps offer for this was that maybe it was a technique that was used to allow for more sprites on the screen at once, as the previous entry in the series lacked more enemies on the screen than its arcade counterpart, so perhaps this was a way of alleviating the problem. So really, there are pros and cons between which of the two first Super Nintendo entries is the better game. But what of the third entry in the Super Nintendo trilogy? Final Fight 3, yet another Super Nintendo exclusive. Let's have a look. Final Fight 3 would see release in 1995, 6 years removed from the game's original arcade entry. The game had a new producer for the series at the helm, in the form of Takuro Fujiwara. He already had a lot of experience at Capcom, previously directing earlier titles such as Ghosts and Goblins, Commando and Bionic Commando, so seemed like a good fit for the role. The game's story follows the events of the previous games and the annihilation of the Mad Gear Gang. However, a new dominant crime syndicate known as the Skull Cross Gang are beginning to cause problems throughout Metro City. In the opening sequence of the title, it features the return of Guy from the original Final Fight game. To add a little additional trivia here, I have heard that apart from him being away training, a reason as to why Guy is not in the second Final Fight game is said to be because he was busy fighting within the Street Fighter Alpha series, as Final Fight and Street Fighter both share the same universe, meaning that Final Fight 3 takes place after the events of the Alpha games, as well as the previous Final Fight games. When Guy returns to Metro City and is reacquainted with his friend Mike Hager, the mayor of the city, the two are suddenly informed that the Skull Cross Gang has started a riot in the downtown area of the city. This information is brought to the table by Lucia, a detective in the Metro City Police Special Crimes Unit. The 3 characters are also joined by Dean, a street fighter and a mysterious man who we shall cover more on shortly. So once again the cast of heroes in Final Fight are tasked with once again saving the day from a crime menace. Like the previous entry, players can play the game cooperatively with a friend. However, obviously the player roster lineup has been increased from a selection of 3 characters up to 4. Speaking of cooperative play between these fighters, the game also offers a play mode where the second player is operated by the CPU. Nice! In relation to this game's fighters, they all function slightly different from one another, just like players would have come to expect from a Final Fight game. They all have their own set of moves, techniques and unique abilities. New to the series' control scheme, players now have the ability to dash, perform dash attacks and jumping dash attacks, like in many other newer beat-em-ups from the era, such as Capcom's very own Captain Commando for example, a game I am keen to cover on here at some point soon. Grabs and throws are also executable within this entry. In terms of mechanics, players now also have access to special techniques, which are command based, much like super moves from the Street Fighter series. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo includes the super move gauge, which fills up as players perform attacks, much like the similar system that is featured within Final Fight 3. Thinking about it, it makes a lot of sense considering the two games are set in the same universe. Just like in the classic Capcom fighter, in this beat-em-up characters can perform these powerful super moves that deplete the entirety of the gauge. A key difference though in Final Fight is that gauges also deplete automatically after a duration of time if the super moves are not used up, which adds to the game's overall strategy. Like in other Final Fights, which is a really stupid name come to think of it, players once again have access to weapons, items that restore health, and items that grant bonus points. These can all once again be located inside smashable storage containers. Speaking of the weapons in Final Fight 3, every character has a specific weapon in which they are a master of using, which means they can perform unique combo attacks if they gather the correct one, which adds another layer to this little game. Now, exactly as you would expect, there are a range of stages to play through, each with their very own boss. Another element, though, that separates this game from its predecessors is that stages sometimes feature multiple paths that change areas players will visit, along with obviously enemies and bosses as well. Adding to the game's overall replayability, the game also features different endings depending on which route players take, the difficulty setting and the characters they choose to play as well, giving owners of this game even further reason to continue to play the game. So let's discuss some of the stages that can be found within this Super Nintendo title. The opening stage of the game looks strikingly similar to the opening stage featured in the first Final Fight game. However, I am sure I remember the similar stage looking much more detailed in the game 6 years prior. Upon checking, it appears that I was correct. The level does not look as crisp this time around, despite Final 3 being developed 6 years later. Let's hope this is not a trend when looking at the art style of the whole game, eh? The character sprites and enemy sprites look okay, but much more like Final Fight 2 before this. They are very pixelated looking rather than more crisp like in the original. At the end of this street, which has clearly been ravaged by the riots, players appear to enter what appears to be a prison. Inside the halls of this building, prisoners can be seen in the background peering through their cell doors, and there are holes in the walls illustrating that the gang must have freed many of its members from confinement. Good simple storytelling in the level design here to illustrate the level of chaos in the city. After literally fly kicking a hole in the wall, showing the place to be not as high security as we thought, the characters arrive out in the sunshine once more. More carnage and destruction can be seen in the background. It all very much reminds me of the London riots a few years ago. The boss fight of the area takes place against a huge man dressed as a police officer named Dave. After the level ends, a text scroll on the screen pops up to tell the player that the riot was just a smokescreen to free the prisoners. Obviously, this conclusion was extremely obvious for gamers to see, thanks to the game's level design. However, I guess this text proves that developers insulting players' intelligence is nothing new. I'm looking at you, Pokemon's Game Freak, who seem to assume the player is dumber with each passing installment. More important information though is then given to the player, revealing that Dean's family was murdered by the gang due to being a street fighter who refused to join them, so he is obviously out for revenge as a result. Amusingly, I think the opening part of Stage 2 looks even more like Stage 1 from the original arcade game than the previous stage we looked at, but it quickly mixes things up by introducing some vertical scrolling, a feature that was first introduced into Final Fight 2. Everything continues to look pretty dystopian moving into the next street, in which the player has to defeat a barefooted fatty Boom Boom at the end of the section. Next, the player progresses into what appears to be a park area, which is very reminiscent of some of the level design found in Streets of Rage 2. But fair play to Capcom, I suppose, considering much of the stage design in the first Streets of Rage game seems to be partially modelled on the first Final Fight game. A large dapper enemy known as Cool Man is the final enemy to take on in this stage, who must be defeated obviously in order to progress. Round 3 of this playthrough starts out fighting in front of some car showroom storefronts. This part of the stage is particularly cool as the glass windows are smashable. If James Bond was playing this game, I'm pretty sure that he would say smashing. This round is extremely short and ends with the player fighting off a few recurring versions of previous larger enemies. Round 4 of the playthrough takes place on a city bridge because, as we have said before on this channel, it did not seem possible in the 90s for programmers to build a beat 'em up without a stage that looked just like this. I love a good sunset though. Marvellous. Players soon end up on a waterfront, again very reminiscent of a stage section found in the original game. Past this section brings players aboard a boat, another trope we nearly always seem to see in beat 'em ups, where the ground the player walks on moves up and down to create the illusion that the boat is bobbing. Amusingly, the boss at the end of this stage is Bluto from the Popeye cartoon, which was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. Following this stage, players reach a bonus round where they have to avoid getting mowed down by a bulldozer, an idea taken straight out of Streets of Rage 3. Once again, I'm slightly bemused by this, as it seems like developers of these style games seem to just constantly rehash one idea after another, rather than coming up with new ones. Are areas to fight through on beat 'em ups really that hard to make unique? The next stage sees players wading their way through sewers because cowabunga dudes, where have I seen this trope in beat 'em ups a million times before? The stage slowly becomes industrial because once again, that's a stage style which always gets placed in these games. I have to say though, I like the enemies, who look like the baseball furies from the Warriors. In fact, why have we got a proper side-scrolling beat 'em up Warriors game? Progressing through the stage, it seems that players get to a section where below the platform characters fight on, there is molten material below. Once again, something we seem to always get in these sort of games. A boss battle takes place against a character called Stray. In regards to something else I would like to point out is that the music does not change in boss fights. Therefore, the sense of impending challenge players receive when playing something like Streets of Rage, for example, is not present here. The final stage of the game is the same style stage that seems to appear in every Final Fight and Streets of Rage game. First, the player walks on a path towards a building, then they must fight their way through a Trump Tower-like premises. You know, all the generic stuff you get on these stages. Control rooms, lift areas, red carpeted hallways with large windows looming in the background, where, as you can guess, there are more challenging enemies in greater numbers than in previous levels in the game. We have seen all of this before elsewhere. There is nothing new to report at all. One thing I will say though, I quite like the final boss section of the area as it takes place next to a helicopter on the tower's roof. I was half expecting to find Mr. X sitting in a throne, so at least there is that. The villain, just named Black, looks like Relento on steroids. Defeating him brings this playthrough to an end. As mentioned earlier in the video, there are various ways for players to play Final Fight, which lead the player to levels that do not appear in each playthrough. To be fair to the game, some of these stages are less generic than some of those featured in this playthrough I've shown, but they are mostly based on old recurring beat 'em up tropes anyway. For example, there is a train stage, there is a stage that takes place in front of crushed cars, a stage in front of luminescent buildings, and a restaurant stage. But ultimately, apart from a few new mechanics, such as the multiple routes, Final Fight 3 is simply not good enough, nor unique enough, in my opinion, for a beat 'em up that came out as late as bloody 1995. This, ladies and gentlemen, was an era where many gamers had moved on to playing titles on the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. Yet here Capcom were releasing a beat 'em up that does not even graphically look as good as Final Fight, what was released in the arcades an entire 6 years earlier. This was a point in time the Streets of Rage trilogy had come and gone. We had seen great console games such as Turtles in Time. Final Fight 3 seemed to bring very little uniqueness to the table and seemed to mainly rehash beat 'em up tropes of old with little style, substance or originality. For this reason, Final Fight 3 is the golden axe of its respective series. The title looked like a relic of the past on release, offering generic gameplay, unoriginal level design, and not much in the way of uniqueness at all. In fact, the Golden Axe 3 comparison is very apt, as this title too had a larger selectable player roster and branching paths, two of the only elements that go in both of these games' favours. So the reason I would imagine not many people have played this one was because it failed to spark imagination on release. It was dated on arrival, and even if players did play this game back in the day, it is far from memorable. In fact, Golden Axe 3 probably has more memorable features and moments within that game. If you get round to playing this one, it will be the most generic beat 'em up you will ever play, leaving you with little in the way of a lasting impression. But enough about me, what about you? For those of you at home who have spent time with this game, what were your thoughts on it? Let me know in the comment section down below. I would love to hear what you think. If you like this video and want more content like this, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss a video. Finally, due to the recent outpouring of extreme support directed towards myself and this channel is now mostly funded by those who back me on Patreon. This is now the channel of the people, and I cannot thank you enough for that. So, massive shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Sean Johnson, Joseph Razmik, Ego, Alethea Swanson, Angel Light 85, Asobi Kwang DX, Carlos Domingos, Computer Man, Daniel Daly, Esteban Gallardo Garcia, Gary Pinkett, Giano V Santisi, Glenny Glenn, House of the Ted, Heo Paulo Lopez, Jordan Durant, Heo Paulo Di Cavallo Piera Vinagre, Lars Zondervan, Michael Baker, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Sponge Matt B, Timothy W. Haskins II, TOG Driver, Since Spacies, Adam Castin, Andis Rainsberg, Andrew Mazansky, Andrew Pearson, Antonio Rodriguez, Bernard NG, Chris Fisk, Chris Margarine, Chris Cool, Craig Jenkins, Dan, Barlow Jr., David Bow, Doug Perkins, Francesco Lacriola, Gregory Smoragi Wicks, Hans Christian, Ivan M, Jake Whitford, James McDonald, Jazzy Tay, Joel, John Bates, King's Knight, Lobster Puncher, Louis Viant, Marvin Aroliga, Master Jinx, Matthew Rindle, Mean Machine Dean, Paul Elliott, RetroReversing.com, Richard Stewart, Rick67, Sarah Powell, Soraya H. Al-Sarai, Stephen Lewis, Time Lord Soundwave, Tom Elliott, Vlamink, Renee, and all of my other patrons. Thank you so much for all of your donations and keeping this channel going through these difficult times. Thank you so much. Yeah. Cheerio.